How can leaders shape the next generation of informed citizens? In a timely conversation, Hoover Institution Director Condoleezza Rice and Utah Governor Spencer Cox discussed the vital role civic leaders play in promoting civic learning and modeling civil debate, especially in today's polarized environment. Both emphasize civic wisdom grows strongest when young people are encouraged to think critically, question with respect, and truly listen, especially to those who see the world differently.
Thanks. To wrap up our program, we have the honor of listening to a conversation between two extraordinary leaders. The first is Director of the Hoover Institution, Condoleezza Rice. We're going to keep these introductions brief in the Washington or policy tradition that the briefer, the more important. Director Rice has had a distinguished career both in academia and public service. She was the 66th Secretary of State and the 19th U.S. National Security Advisor. Also joining us this afternoon is the 18th Governor of Utah, Governor Spencer Cox. Governor Cox has a long-standing record of public service, having served as a city council member, mayor, county commissioner, and state legislator before being appointed as Utah's lieutenant governor in 2013. He was sworn in as governor on January 4th, 2021. And he recently served as the 2023 to 24 chairman of the National Governors Association, where he sought to bridge the divide of polarization with his Disagree Better initiative. Please join me in welcoming Director Condoleezza Rice and Governor Spencer Cox.
Very much for being with us at this very important conference. We're delighted the representation here of people from across the spectrum who care about this issue of civics and civic education has been really inspiring for all of us. So it was great to have you here at the Hoover Institution, and please come back. We will continue to pursue these topics, and so please watch for this space and come back. But I just want to thank you very much for having been involved, and I mostly want to thank Governor Cox for joining us for a conversation. The governor has been a leader in civil discourse, making his Disagree Better campaign the focal point of much of his time. Utah has been a leader among states focusing on civic education, and so we look forward to your wisdom about how to do it. But I want to start with more of a personal side. So we talk a lot about civic engagement. We talk a lot about democratic engagement. But as much as we love civic engagement, very few of us actually decide to run for office. And you did. And that's a particularly important kind of civic engagement. And so can you take us through a little bit your journey as decisions about running for office? What was it like?
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for having me. Thanks to the civic leaders out in our country, all of you who are here today. Somebody asked me why I was here, and I said, well, when Condoleezza Rice says, will you come, you do. That's what you do. So I'm honored to be here. Look, my journey actually started, and I was thinking about this. I was talking to my wife a little bit about what I might share here. And my journey actually starts at 8 years old. And I think that's really important because it's different for all of us. But I know we have a lot of teachers out there, or people who represent teachers. I grew up in a very small town, 1,200 people, right in the middle of Utah, a small mountain town. And we were very poor. Grew up on the same farm that my great-great-great-grandfather settled 160 years ago. So we don't get out much. And but I had an uncle who got out, and he went to Washington D.C. and he worked for the federal government. And I don't think I'd ever been outside the state of Utah. I'd never been on a plane, and he offered to help pay for my family to go back to DC. And so we did. We went back to Washington, DC, and we did all the things you do when you go to Washington, DC. And I remember we went to Monticello, and I know we have some Monticello folks out here. There they are, my people. I got a book. They had a book in the gift store back then. It was called My First Book on Thomas Jefferson. Clever title. And I read it like 20 times, and I caught the bug. And so, but look, so fast forward, my dad had served as the mayor of my little town when I was growing up. Now, if you think that's impressive, everybody's dad served as the mayor of our little town at one point or another. That's kind of how it happened. And fast forward, I graduated from law school. My wife and I, we had 3 boys at the time, decided to move back and raise our kids in that same small town. I had been back a few months, and a friend of mine on the city council came to me and said, hey, we have a vacancy. Somebody just moved. So it's not an election. We're just appointing someone. We've talked about it. We think you would be really great. And I was flattered, and I said, why do you think I'd be great? And he said, well, so the truth is we can't get anybody else to do it, and so it's your turn, basically. And he said, and we have this huge legal problem, and we can't really afford an attorney. And we were hoping that if you were on the city council, you would do free legal work for the city. And how can you say no to that? So that's how I got started. I became the mayor after that, and then a county commissioner in our county, and then got elected to the House of Representatives, where I served for 9 months. And our lieutenant governor resigned, and Governor Herbert asked me to serve as his lieutenant governor, and then I became governor. So that was kind of my path. Never expected, never intended, but I'm very grateful that I had an opportunity to serve and give back in my local community.
Right. And so yours is really a story of something that people often say, which is that when government is close to the people, they tend to trust it more. One of the things that we've been concerned about, and one of the reasons for our Center for Revitalizing American Institutions, is the kind of loss of confidence and the loss of faith in institutions that we're reading about in polling. But when one talks about local government, people are more inclined to trust that government because it's closer to them. Your story then is one of very much coming up through kind of local government. So can you talk first a little bit about how you've kept touch with the people who now see you on television or see you out as governor, but would once have been able to run into you in the grocery store? Because I do think, and you know, when you're talking about a state like California, it's so big, so maybe it's even more of a problem in a state like California. But how do you think about keeping that common touch, so to speak, as your governor?
Well, that's a very Jeffersonian argument that we need to keep power closer to the people. One of the ways I do it is I still go to the grocery store, and I still do my own grocery shopping, and I still run into people, and I think that matters. Look, it's a deeply polarized world. I know we'll talk about this. It's getting more polarized all the time. I'm very concerned about the loss of trust in institutions. My team will tell you that when I became governor, one of the very first things we talked about was trust, and what is trust? And I think this matters in relationship to this conversation. So the Edelman Trust Index, the Edelman Group does every year, they do surveys all across the world about trust in different institutions. And about 5 years ago, they realized they had never defined trust. They just asked the question. We all know what trust is, we think. But they define trust in 2 ways. Actually, not in 2 ways. They define trust in 1 way. It was a formula. And they said trust is composed of 2 things. It is competency and ethics. That's it. So just think about that for a second. You know, you might have somebody, if you trust somebody to watch your kids or drive your car, right? We all know people that are very ethical, very good people, but they're completely incompetent. You wouldn't let them watch your kids or take your car. Conversely, we know people that are incredibly confident but have no ethical behavior, right? They're just not good people. And also, you wouldn't want them watching your kids or driving your car. So that's how I think about it. And I do believe that staying connected to people is critically important in that. It's hard to hate people up close, right? And again, sorry to keep bringing up Jefferson, but he understood that. He would have these dinners and bring in people, even people he didn't like or didn't get along with, because he knew that over dinner when we're breaking bread, it's hard to hate each other. Now, it does get more difficult. Utah is a fast-growing state. We have 3.5 million people now, so we're the 30th largest state, which puts us in that middle tier. And so I go back to my small town as often as possible, where I'm not the governor. I'm just that kid who got in trouble a lot, and people see me as that. I try to meet and have interactions with just not the people around me. I try to get off Capitol Hill as often as possible. I try to visit all 29 counties in our state every year. I travel to the rural areas, travel to the urban areas, and just listen and learn. And you can diffuse, you can engender trust and diffuse anger and hostility that way. That being said, I still don't have the answers in a social media world where where a lie can travel around the world before the truth puts its boots on. That's kind of what we're facing, and the hard things travel quickly. The wins are kind of hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about preparing the citizen for the world that we live in now. I'm old enough that as a citizen, all I had to do was watch one of the three, Walter Cronkite or Harry K. Smith, or in our case, it was Huntley Brinkley, and that was it. But one of the challenges now, as you mentioned, the information sources are so broad. There's so many of them not reliable, but quite certain of their positions. And so
often wrong, but never in doubt.
Yeah. Often wrong, but never in doubt. And so it would seem that this problem of preparing the citizen to be a citizen has become more difficult. But let's go back to the roots of that. So civic education is really about preparing people to be good citizens and to be able to take advantage of their citizenship. I was saying earlier in a podcast, one of the problems in these institutions and whether people believe in them is that maybe they don't know them. And if you don't know them, you won't trust them. And when you think back to the Founding Fathers, it was actually a pretty wild idea at the end of the 18th century that you would have self-governance for people, and they would exercise their rights through these abstractions called institutions. And we all had to learn, I did, probably you did, what they were supposed to do, and we came to trust them in part by knowing them. Nowadays, civic education, why should we be in a room like this concerned about preparing the citizen to be a better citizen? And how do you think about civic education? What do we really mean by that?
Yeah, I saw the other day, someone said that everything's a conspiracy when you don't know how anything works. And I think there's some truth to that, right? And the founders were deeply concerned. I mean, they debated amongst themselves. Right. They weren't sure. I mean, John Adams and Hamilton, they were having these debates at Madison about whether the people could be trusted to learn enough to self-govern. And here we are kind of living that out. They understood human nature. And I so appreciate what I've learned today, being in some of the different courses where people were sharing. That I think it was Sharon McMahon who said it's complicated by design. Like, that's a feature, not a flaw. And they made it that way so no one group would ever get too much power. But that's incredibly frustrating, and especially when people who should know better, who do understand these institutions, tell people that they should be expecting things that government just can't deliver or was never intended to deliver. And so this idea that if we just win this next election, then we won't have to deal with those people ever again. Yuval Levin talks about this in his new book on the Constitution. And the idea was that we're always going to have to deal with those people. Right? That was always intended. The Constitution forces us to work together, but we have to understand how it works for it to work. And so if we're not starting at a young age, then it becomes almost impossible. I would submit to you that the longer we wait to start to learn how this stuff works, the less possible it is that we will ever learn how this stuff works, because we do have a fractured media now, and you can always find whatever it is that makes you feel good, whatever point of view that you're coming from. You will find confirmation of those biases unless you have some media literacy, and media literacy is part of civic education. So there's the knowledge piece of this, that this is what the legislative branch does, and this is how it operates. And we've got to, as citizens, let me just add this, Connie, that we have to teach the idea that you have a duty as a citizen to be informed, right? Like the founders talked a lot about virtues and what those virtues are. We don't use words like that very often. The pursuit of happiness was not just whatever made you feel good. The pursuit of happiness was actually about self-improvement, constant self-improvement, making ourselves better, a very distinct virtue in pursuing happiness. And part of that is that we have a duty, if we live in this country, to understand how this country works. And you have to work to be able to do that. And that is something that is completely lost on generations of us, and we have to figure out how to get it back.
Yeah, I think it is lost on generations. You know, when I was a kid, there was that little bill with the feet on it, and it went through the legislature and so forth. And so, you know, I can still remember it to this
Schoolhouse
day.
Rock.
The Schoolhouse
That's
Rock and the
it.
like. But I completely agree that earlier is better. So that means that we have to make sure that the schools are making it a part of their mission to teach civics. And sometimes my mom was a teacher, and in her latter years, she would talk about all the mandates that she had in school. She had to teach a little bit about that, and she had to do this, and she had to do that. And I can imagine that for teachers sometimes it's, and I have to teach civics. So how do you, because you've also been at the local level, but how do you get as a leader in your state, and really nationally as well, how do you make the case that the schools really do have to do this? How do you encourage it? What's the role of the elected official in getting our schools to take this on? And we all know that the American school system is very decentralized, so Washington can have a view, but mostly it's at the local and state level.
It is, and what we're trying to do, and again, Utah is not perfect. We need to do more. We have these same discussions about how can we get more civics into our schools. We're one of the states that requires a half year in high school instead of a full year. And I do worry about all the kind of the top-down approach, even from the state level. We like it being more at the local level. But look, civics can be infused into just about everything we do. I think that's really important. And that's, my hope is teachers feel like they're under attack right now. And they feel it in my state too. And we hear it often. And so how do you get politics out of the classroom and civics in, right? That's one of the mistakes we've made, is to allow politics in many of our classrooms, especially higher ed, and we can talk about that. But how do we get politics out and civics in? Well, one of the things I love today, because I'm a huge believer in this, and I believe it was Mr. King who was on from SUNY. I came in late, so I think Chancellor King. He talked about the importance of debate. He talked about his daughter's high school and how she had to write a paper in ninth grade, but then in 10th grade she had to take the other side of that.
Yeah.
So one of the things we found is that debate is incredibly important as part of civic life. And by the way, one of the byproducts of this is young people who debated in middle school, high school, or college are much less polarized than the rest of us, which is great news. And so one of the things that we found when you're talking about difficult subjects or whatever it is having debate in your classroom. But this is very important. Don't just allow the kids to debate what they believe in or what their parents believe in or what they watched on Fox News or MSNBC last night or saw on TikTok. Assign them a position, right? And say, hey, this half of the class is going to argue for abortion and this half against it. I don't care what I'm going to take the politics out. I don't care what you personally believe. We're going to assign you to do this. And then we're going to flip sides and have those discussions and debates. That can start at a very young age, having open discussion and discourse about topics, again, but not bringing our politics into it, helping them understand that there are two sides to every debate, helping them understand that we do have these institutions in our town. You can start understanding what a mayor does, what a city council does in first grade. I mean this is not complicated stuff. And I do think that just those little, bringing civics into, whether you're a science teacher, science has become politicized, right? So how do we take the politics out of that? Whatever it is you're teaching, bring civics into it. Show them how what you're teaching applies to being a good American citizen, and that will carry through for the rest of their life.
That's a very good point, because there is a lot of agreement across the political spectrum that we ought to be teaching civics. I think a lot of Americans are feeling that. When you get to what should the content be, that's when you get into a lot of, shall we say, polarization again about what the content ought to be. But what you're suggesting really is more about a kind of process, a way of thinking, a way of learning. So you debate, you take the other side. You're forced to make the arguments about what the other side might, and to take those arguments seriously. So that really is getting away from what the content per se might be.
Yeah, and I hope you appreciate the nuance there. It's very different than coming into class and saying, well, Roe v. Wade, I think that was a huge mistake, or I think that was great. Again, the best teachers, you have no idea what they're, at least in my case, and the case of my kids, had no idea whether my teacher was a Republican or a Democrat. They were so good at what they did and so good at arguing both sides and helping me to see both sides that I had no idea where they were coming from. But it gave us as a class, and again, my kids who have had these opportunities, a different appreciation for, and an open-mindedness. It teaches you to think critically. What do I really believe? And it teaches you to be curious. And this is maybe more important than anything else that we should be teaching in civics is a curiosity, a desire for learning, a desire for understanding. And that curiosity will carry them through. I wish a lot of our political leaders had a little more curiosity, a willingness to re-examine our own positions and question ourselves to see if we're mistaken. Learned Hand had this great speech on liberty, the spirit of liberty. He said, and I'll misquote this, but the spirit of liberty is that spirit that is not too sure it is right. The spirit of liberty is that spirit that is willing to listen to the minds of other men and women. And that's what liberty is, this idea, not that we're right and everything else be damned, it's this idea that we're willing to listen and to learn from each other and to update our own beliefs when we're wrong, and then stand powerfully behind our beliefs when we know we're right.
It takes a certain discipline as a teacher to do what you've just said. We have this problem very often in the university where... very often in the university. I had a personal case where I taught a seminar and I chose 25 students out of 160 applicants, and they would write an application to the class. And one of the applicants wrote that he wanted to take my class. He was a pacifist. I thought, okay, that's going to be an interesting combination. And so I admitted him. Benji was his name. And his first paper was just a bunch of ad hominem stuff. So I gave him a shape that Stanford students had never seen, which was a C. And he came to me and he said, you just didn't like my ideas. I said, Benji, I said, this is so poorly written that I can't tell what your ideas are. I said, so you and I are going to have a deal. I'm going to make you the best pacifist ever, but I'm not going to let you get away with sloppy thinking. And I felt very strongly that that was my obligation, not to convince him that pacifism was a problem, right?
Thank you.
And so getting that discipline among teachers is very important, and our students deserve it. So good for you for thinking about processes that allow you to take the politics, extract the politics, and to really understand how to carry out the discourse. But now I'm going to go back to the question of not what happens in the classroom, but what happens in our politics. And sometimes I think we can talk all we want to our students about civic engagement, civil discourse, the importance of listening to other examples and to listening to people who disagree. and then they turn on the television and they see their putative leaders going to their corners. And it's not about policy, it's about if you disagree with me, then you're morally corrupt somehow. So we're not, to use a term, modeling very good behavior for young people. And you've tried to deal with that. You've tried to deal with it in bringing people into your orbit who disagree, in the political sense, doing things across the aisle with other governors. I was just with you at the National Governors Association, which you headed a little, and it seems to me that governors are trying pretty hard at this, knowing that maybe the Washington example, and this goes back a long time in Washington, so no particular administration, going back a long time, that there's a kind of politics as combat that we're seeing that I think the founders would have never really imagined. So can you talk a little bit about some of your efforts to bring this good thinking about how to be a civic engagement in politics to our political leaders?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I mean, when we think about the founders, they were pretty brutal to each other at times, right? There's some great examples of this. And
yeah, as a matter of fact, at one point, we were in the Oval Office, and President Bush said, "Well, at least the Vice President hasn't killed the Secretary of the Treasury, so let's remember."
It's fair. We haven't had a duel in a while. Although,
yes, right.
I mean, who knows? It could happen. The way things are shaping up, it's possible. So I don't want to say that so this is one of the problems. When we talk about civility, and civility and civics, I think, go hand in hand, too often we define civility wrongly, in that civility is kind of, we all have to get along and just be nice to each other, right? Certainly we do need to be nicer to each other. Don't get me wrong. I think that's very important. But that's not what civility properly understood means. And I'll go back to something that Yuval Levin wrote in his most recent book, American Covenant. He says that unity is not thinking the same. Unity is acting together, which is very different. And the Constitution is the thing that forces us to act together. That was the intention of it. Now, there are some things that the founders would not have believed, and it's not politics as blood sport. I think there was some of that going around, but politics as entertainment would certainly have been foreign to them. Having an entire branch of government, by the way, intentionally the most powerful branch of government is the Congress. Having that branch of government willingly giving away their power to the executive and the judiciary, honestly, to both, and to unelected bureaucrats, which they did not envision at all, would have been very confounding to them. And so here's where Disagree Better kind of came from. As chair of the National Governors Association, we get an opportunity to have an initiative where the other governors work together. And so we had some ideas, and these ideas, and I know some of you have heard me share this before, so I apologize to you, but the ideas were around healthcare and energy policy and all these really important things that we care about. But we started to realize, like, we can't solve any of the biggest problems in our country if we all hate each other. And so we thought, is there something we could do? And so we started talking to experts, including here at the Stanford Depolarization Lab, which was incredibly helpful, and other institutions who have studied depolarization, and asking the question, can we as elected officials do something about this? And it turns out the answer is yes. And we did some experiments. We did some of these videos where a Republican governor and a Democratic governor, this came out of something I did when I was running for office the first time against my Democratic opponent. It was 2020, crazy time, right? We'd had kind of COVID, obviously, a summer of discontent with George Floyd's murder and all of these terrible things happening, and we could see the writing on the wall. And I was worried, and so a month before the election, I asked my Democratic opponent if he would do an ad with me, and he thought I was crazy, and said, "What's the catch?" And I said, "No catch. we'll just get together and we'll say, I'm Spencer Cox and I think you should vote for me. And you say, I'm Chris Peterson, I think you should vote for me. And while we disagree on a lot of things, we both agree that Utah is an amazing place, that we can disagree without hating each other, and that we care about our country and respecting the results of this election, whatever happens. And we did it, it went viral, and Stanford studied it.
Yes.
And we didn't know that was happening, and they came back and said, hey, this actually works. Like, it has a depolarizing effect on people. And we think you should do more of it. And so we did, and we had 23 governors that participated, which was a surprise to a lot of people, Republicans and Democrats. And we filmed some ads together. We did these events all across the country. And there was More in Common did some polling. And Stanford looked at the new ads and did some other studies and polling with people. We found out that not only did it have a depolarizing effect, the people who watched these ads actually liked the public officials who were doing them more. They were more likely to vote for that person, which is good news, right? That positive campaigning actually might work better than negative campaigning, which would be cool. Because as much as I wanted elected officials to do this out of the goodness of their heart and because they care about our country, I knew the only way to get them to do it is if it would help them get elected. And so we wanted to show that as well. And it turns out that most Americans hate what's happening in our country today. And so, look, I'm not great at this, and no politician is, because the incentive structure that we have set up right now is an incentive structure to just tear down. If you want to get your name in the paper or on social media, you should be outrageous. If you look at who has the most followers on social media, who gets the most hits on social media, they're not the people who are disagreeing better. I will just tell you that right now. Yeah. And yet, there is a desperate hunger out there. 70% of Americans hate what's happening in politics right now. So I believe there is a role for elected officials to play at every single level of government. Again, it doesn't mean that we have to give up on what we believe. It doesn't mean that we just have to get along. It does not mean that at all. It means you should defend your values and the things that you believe in, that you should stand for truth as you see it. But it also means that you should attack ideas and not people, that you should treat other people with dignity and respect, that you should understand that we are all Americans and part of this system working together, disagreeing within it, trying to win votes and trying to win elections and building coalitions as the founders intended so that we can get 60 votes in the Senate and be able to actually get some things done in this country. But it doesn't mean that we should tear down and burn it all down, because that comes at a cost, and it's a cost I'm not sure that we're prepared to face as Americans.
Right. So let me link the two threads that we've been talking about, because on the one hand, we have this problem of polarization. We have the problem of politicians, people who are responsible, really. We elect to be responsible for a lot that is really important to every single citizen, and in some cases, they're playing to the disagreeable side of politics. And then we have this absence of civic education, so that the unfortunately average citizen really maybe can name that there are three branches of government, maybe not. So we've got, in some ways right now, the worst of circumstances. We've got politics that is really modeling the behavior that is not inspiring, and we have people who don't really understand and who don't understand the institutions. And so maybe it's not surprising that we have a lot of disaffection in the population, that people feel somehow powerless, that they will follow the siren song sometimes if people gives them easy answers. So it's harder and harder to talk about the hard choices that we face as Americans, because it's kind of fast food politics. Let me make you feel good. So it really is eroding then the basis of our democratic system. So can you relate now, going back, if we were able better to educate our citizens about these institutions, about their rights, how their rights are carried out, but also their responsibilities, And we were able to do that from, let's pick an age 7. And we kept doing what a friend of mine called booster shots up through college and maybe even as adults. Do you see a different future?
Yeah.
That civic education and really attention to understanding the institutions might help us to bridge this divide that sometimes just seems to be growing, and either people are checking out, which a lot of people are doing, or they're just becoming dispirited about democracy. I know that some of the polling among young people is that they really don't think that democracy is better than any other system. Some of them, because I don't think we've taught them very well either, think that authoritarianism might be okay. They'd rather have a benign dictator, and when I'm faced with that, I often say to them, yeah, but you better be sure that the dictator's benign, and that's the problem. They usually aren't. But we are losing that kind of sense that we can affect things, and therefore democracy is the right system. So how can civic education begin to repair that?
Well, the founders were right, and it's the only way we can repair this. I don't see an easy way out of this one, right? The only way out is for we the people. If we're waiting for Washington D.C. or politicians, look, politics we always say is downstream of culture. Now, I do think that politicians have a role to play and a responsibility to play, and I wish that we could get more of them to play that role. It's hard, the incentives are against us. I make mistakes all of the time. I'm constantly trying to improve and be better, but I'm not the perfect example. But if we think that this is going to come from Washington, D.C. or even the state level, it's just not going to happen. We kind of get what we deserve as a country, and this is what we deserve, this polarization, this fractured nature, huge swings from one party to another, executive orders on the left and then executive orders on the right. And yeah, you might want your dictator today as long as it's the one that you like on your side, right? And every power that can be used today can be used against you tomorrow. And so I just think the only way out of this is at every level of education and adulthood that we understand how this stuff works. We're far less likely to fall for the I was going to say fake news, but it's not even that. But fall for what they're trying to sell us. Fall for the fear and demagoguery that we see. And again, it's happening in both parties. And if we truly understand how this stuff works and how we can influence it, that's the other thing I tell people. When I got elected to the House of Representatives in Utah, the state house, I expected to be overwhelmed by my constituents. I expected to have, phone calls, and I was never going to be able to keep up. And then it was crickets. Mm-hmm. Now, I was overwhelmed by form emails from people who were not in my district. Like, I would get thousands on one issue, and they all said exactly the same thing. But when I actually got a unique letter or a phone call or a text from someone in my district on an issue, that meant something to me. I changed my vote on several bills. I mean, we have hundreds of bills in a legislative session, and I only really care about maybe 40 of them. There were 500 others that, great, sure, I don't know, maybe, yeah. And if someone in my district really felt profoundly about something, they could make a difference. But so many of them didn't know. They didn't think they could make a difference. They'd been told that their voice didn't matter. And that's very dispiriting, and people start to lose hope. And that's where we truly get in trouble, I think, as a nation. Not when people engage poorly, but when they disengage completely. Yeah. That's what I worry the most about. And if you know how it works, you're much more likely to be in the game and to be part of the solution.
We've been talking a lot about the institutions of governance and the institutions that we've bequeathed, these amazing institutions, the Constitution, which over 200 years has gotten more and more people into we the people. But there's another part of American democracy that we often don't talk enough about, and it was de Tocqueville who came here in 1835, and he wanted to understand these Americans. And he said that they formed themselves into these voluntary associations just to do good. Now, today we would think about them as Boys and Girls Clubs or the American Red Cross or the Salvation Army or the Sierra Club or whatever the Rotary clubs. This layer of civil society, and I can tell you that when I was going around the world in what some people called democracy promotion, which by the way is a term I hate, it's really encouraging people who want the same rights that we do, the right to say what you think, worship as you please, be free from the knock of the secret police at night, and be able to choose those who are going to govern you. That's the basics of democracy. But I would often say, yeah, there are a few things you have to do. Don't let the executive get too powerful. Have some checks and balances. Have an educated population. We've been talking about that. And civil society, where people take on responsibility for individual citizens away from the government in a sense. And talk a little bit about Utah and civil society, because you have some great examples, and how as governor you relate to civil society.
Yeah, thank you. This is probably the most important part of the conversation today. My team's smiling over there. They're like, wow, he went like 40 minutes without bringing up Alexis de Tocqueville, and she did it first. So I get to play the de Tocqueville card. So he comes here in 1830s and he sees this, and very different than anywhere else, right? Very different than Europe. These voluntary associations that are getting together. I would just add to that religion was a very big part of those voluntary associations, and this country would be unrecognizable to him now because of the way that's changed. Look, we're lonelier than I truly believe that loneliness is at the heart of all of our dysfunction right now. And that's being driven now by our smartphones. It certainly started it was first noticed, Bowling Alone, the book that came out, started talking about this over 20 years ago now. And Professor Putnam started recognizing this, but then it got accelerated with the advent of the smartphone and these social media apps that have taken us away, where we don't have true friendships and true connections. And this is incredibly dangerous for those institutions that we talked about. How many Rotarians do we have here today? Would you please raise your hands? I love you. Oh my gosh, there's like 4 of you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Right.
My people. 40 years ago, we would have asked that question.
Yeah, huge.
Almost every hand in here would have gone up. And less religious attendance than we've had ever before in American history. So why does that matter? Well, look, if we're lonely, we're going to look for connections. We're wired for connections. And if we don't have these good associations to help each other, then we're going to find it somewhere else. If we don't have any real friends, we can hate the same people together on Facebook, right? So we have these bad tribes that have formed. So there's that part. It adds to the polarization, the decline in these voluntary associations. Now, the second piece, I think, matters as well. We're very fortunate in Utah. We lead the nation in service every year, and we lead the nation in charitable giving every year. And there's something magical that happens when we serve and give back to our communities. So it's not just the polarization piece, but we solve a lot of problems that government was never designed to solve. This is not a partisan statement. It sounds a little bit like a Republican talking point. I assure you that it is not, okay? Government was designed to be complicated. I'm talking to a bunch of civics people here. It was designed to be very slow. It was designed to be very methodical. It was designed not to change quickly, although it is changing quickly now with the imperial kings or the imperial presidents and the ability to issue executive orders when you become president, right? That was never the intention. We had a king. We tried that. We decided we didn't like it. And so when I was running my business, I would wake up in the morning with a good idea, and I could implement that good idea at the end of the day. Now I wake up with a good idea, and if I'm lucky, next January, when my legislature's back in session, they'll pass some terrible version of what I thought was a good idea, if it passes at all, right? And I have a board of directors of 104 legislators in my state who all think they should be the CEO, and it's not designed to solve all of our problems. And so we had these associations that were doing that. They were building the hospitals. They were building schools at the time in 1835 when Tocqueville was here, and they were taking care of their neighbors. When somebody died or somebody lost a job, their congregation was there to pick them up and help them, right? So what happens when those things go away? Well, the last line of defense is government. And so now we're asking government to do things it was never intended to do and isn't good at, and is very expensive. It costs much more when government tries to do it. And government can't come watch your kids when you have to go to the doctor. It just doesn't work that way. And so this civil society part of this, again, is service. So we started in Utah. I have to give a shout out to Wes Moore, governor of Maryland, who's doing a service project. National service, I think, is really important. We started a service initiative in Utah because it's been in our DNA, but we're starting to lose it with our young people. So now we have cohorts who take a gap year between high school and college, where we will give them a stipend to go work with nonprofits in our state, so they get that service bug. They get to give back. I volunteered for my church for 2 years. I went to Mexico, where we did service, required service every week. Changed my life, changed the way I look at the world, changed the way I care about people who are different than me, who speak a different language. I was a minority in a country trying to learn Spanish, and I was grateful for that. It made me a better person. It made me a better American. And I want to make sure that kids get those opportunities. And it also turns out it's good for your health. Service, there are studies that show that service can lower your blood pressure. It can make you a healthier person, and it depolarizes. When we give back to our community, we don't seem to care if we're painting a fence together, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. We just want to make our community a better place. And so that piece of civil society, we become an intensely selfish society. We expect to have everything we want immediately. I push a button and Amazon will have it on my porch, in a couple hours. And I can just get my dopamine hits all day long just staring at this device. It's so bad for our communities, it's bad for our souls, it's bad for our country. And we need to get back to understanding that we have a duty, a responsibility to make our country a better place.
Fantastic, yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, let me ask you to reflect on a couple of things. First, you get up every day and you're governor and you've got any number of problems and concerns. I know a little bit like that. I used to say that I would get up every day and I'd go into my office, and no matter what I wanted to do that day, there was some ugly ball in the middle of it, and it might be called Russia or it might be called Iran, and I just kind of had to deal with it, and I know what that's like.
I'm glad I don't have to deal with Russia or Iran, but I have some ugly balls.
Yeah, but you have an ugly ball too. And that's part of being in leadership positions. But given all that you have tried to do to work on civic education, to make Utah a leader in that area, to work on polarization with the efforts to get people to disagree more agreeable, to put it, what makes you confident or makes you optimistic even that we can make progress on this really important element, as our democracy will soon, our Declaration of Independence will soon be 250 years old, which is starting to get pretty mature as a country. Yeah.
Connie, some of the founders didn't believe it would last that long.
Right. Right.
They thought 100 years would be a long time if we could make it that long. And so we've had a good run, everybody. Look, I am hopeful. I believe in this place. I believe in us. I still believe in we the people. What gives me hope is that we've been through some really ugly times. It's easy. Look, we all have recency bias. It's easy to say things are worse than they've ever been. Turns out that's not true. It's not the worst it's ever been. Like, we literally just killed each other in a civil war that was pretty awful. 600,000 Americans died. We're not there. And And I mentioned some of the data that people don't like where we are as a country, and we have a history of having pendulums swing one way and then they swing back. I apologize for quoting Yuval so much. This is not an ad for his book, but he said something that I like. He was asked about optimism, and he said, I hate optimism. I'm like, who hates optimism? Nobody hates optimism. He said, no. He said, look, optimism is this idea that good things are just going to happen. He said, in the history of our country, good things have never just happened. He said, optimism is a vice, not that unlike pessimism. This idea that things just happen, good or bad, right? But he says, I am hopeful, and hope is the virtue that sits between the vices of optimism and pessimism. And hope is this idea that good things are going to happen because we make them happen. These are choices that we have made as a country that have led us to this point. And we can make different choices. We can choose to serve our neighbors. We can choose to treat each other with dignity and respect. We can choose to get off of social media and go meet our neighbors. We can choose to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence by teaching our kids and our grandkids what those inalienable rights are that we are endowed with from our Creator. This idea that, this unique idea in the history of the world that all of us are created equal. And that we do have the rights to life, liberty, and that pursuit of happiness, that pursuit of personal excellence, that we can choose reason over passions. We get to choose, and it is a time for choosing for all of us. We get to decide what our country's going to look like, and we get to teach that to the next generation. This gathering today gives me hope. What you are doing here at Stanford gives me hope that there are still good people in this fight. It's why we've kept Disagree Better going, because we believe in us. And so I think this next year really gives us an entree. I was one in 1976 when we celebrated the 200th year. My wife, by the way, is named Abigail, after Abigail Adams. She's a bicentennial baby. And I think, wow, at the 200th anniversary, we were naming our kids after the founders. Like, that's how big this celebration was. So let's blow the doors off of this thing, and let's remember, and let us teach our kids and our grandkids that, yes, we are a flawed country. And yes, when we wrote those words, my hero, Thomas Jefferson, who in many ways was not a hero, to many people was not a hero. When he wrote those words that all men are created equal, that did not apply at the time to a whole bunch of people in this country. Women, blacks, mainly just white property owners at the time. And yet, those ideals were much bigger. There is so much to believe in as a country. It was those very words that Abraham Lincoln used to free the slaves. Those very words that Martin Luther King Jr. used to help pass the Civil Rights Act and to bring us together as a country. That we don't give up. We don't give up on those things because it's not perfect. I'll finish with this. My great-great-great-grandfather built a house in Illinois. And he was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You probably know us as the Mormons. And a mob didn't like their religion and some of the things they were doing. The mob came and burned down their house, burned it to the ground. My great-great-great-grandmother was home with the kids at the time. She was pregnant. Two men showed up with torches and said, "We're going to burn your house down." And she said, "Not until you help me carry out this piece of furniture that my dad built for me." And they said, "No, you don't understand. We're going to burn your house down." And she said, "You're not burning my house down until you help me carry this furniture out." So they put their torches down, they carried the hutch out, and then they burned their house to the ground. And they cooked their dinner on the coals of the house. They put what they had left in a wagon, and they left for Utah. Okay? Utah was not part of the United States at that time. It was not a territory of the United States. It was technically part of Mexico. to practice their religion guaranteed to them under the Constitution, they felt like they actually had to leave the United States to do that. When they got to Salt Lake City, the first thing my grandfather was asked to do was to go up into the mountains, to cut down the tallest pine tree he could find, to erect that pine tree in the square, the town square that they were building, and to raise the flag of the United States of America on that tree. And he did it gladly. The country that had just kicked them out, he wanted to honor that country. Why? Because he believed in America. He believed in the ideals of the best of America. That's who we are. We are not our flaws. We are a people who care in making things better for each other. I believe in us. I believe it's still inside of each of us, and I believe that we can instill that in our kids if we're intentional about it, and that's what you're doing. So God bless you, and thank you.
Well, that was absolutely inspirational, and I think a great way to thank you for being with us, but everything that you do every day. Thank you so very much. And I want to thank the audience again for participating. I think we're all inspired to go out there and make civics work for our kids. And don't forget, there are a lot of adults that also need civics. So thank you very much, and I'm going to turn it back to Louise at this point. All right.